We're going to begin with the first principle of the 5. These are not in any priority order. These are 5 principles that we think together can be recognized and are largely compatible, in fact. The idea of public beneficence is to act so as to maximize public benefits and minimize public harm. And the principle encompasses the duty of a society and of government to promote intellectual activities and institutional practices, including scientific and biomedical research that have great potential to improve the public's well-being. The Belmont Report, which brought this principle to the fore as far as Presidential Commission reports, was directed to research involving human subjects, and it defined beneficence to require that, and I quote, "Persons are treated in an ethical manner not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also by making efforts to secure their well-being," end quote. There are 2 general rules that stem from this principle that we have taken very seriously. The first rule is simply stated, do no harm. And the second rule is to maximize public benefits and minimize public harms, or maximize potential public benefits and minimize potential public harms. For synthetic biology and other emerging technologies, we need to apply the principle of beneficence beyond the individual level, which was the primary emphasis of the Belmont Report because it treated conduct regarding human subject research. We have focused largely, not exclusively, on the institutional, community, and public levels. And this is an important feature of all of these principles, that they apply not only to individual action, but also to institutional, communal responsibilities as well. So to put it briefly, policymakers should adopt a societal perspective when deciding whether to pursue particular benefits of synthetic biology research in the face of risks and uncertainty. When deciding whether to restrict these pursuits, a similar consideration of community interests and the potential positive and negative impacts is essential. So we're going to begin with our recommendations under public beneficence, and Lonnie Ali will start. Yes, and we have 3 provisional recommendations under public beneficence, and I will ask 3 of the commission members to present those, and then we'll open it up for discussion and comment.
Thank you.
And
I'll get it in a second. The commission, during its deliberations, has found that, as Amy stated, that SynBio has great potential to improve the public's well-being. The impact on the public can be seen in areas of medical and healthcare, food, transportation, energy, along with other means to improve people's lives. However, there is a diversity of interest in practitioners. There's public, private, and what we call your do-it-yourselfers. The intermingling of academic and commercial research, both basic and applied, provides fertile ground for innovation. There was a collaboration that came together of private and public funds in the development of semi-synthetic artemisinin, an anti-malarial drug that demonstrated how academic, public, and nonprofit industry interests have come together to promote good and global well-being. However, most potential products of SynBio are in very early stages of development. Basic research is critical to further expansion of this science and the effective translation into useful products. At the same time, the area of exploration is in competition for scarce resources with other areas of science and other societal needs. In the future, decisions will be required regarding which research directions deserve funding over others. These decisions should be driven in part by which strategies offer the most promise based on scientific, technical, and social considerations. Our first recommendation states, through a central body such as the Executive Office of the President, the EOP, the federal government should undertake a coordinated evaluation of current public funding for SynBio activities, including risk assessment, and the consideration of ethical and social issues to ensure effective use of public funds, increase transparency, and avoid redundancy. As the emerging technology, the field of synthetic bio continues to advance, resulting in novel products and applications, the ability to maintain oversight and accountability, provide risk assessment while evaluating potential benefits that contribute to the public good becomes increasingly difficult as more and more SynBio research is funded through private dollars. This imbalance impedes the ability of any oversight agency to provide good stewardship over research efforts in the private sector that may not be visible or accessible for review. In addition, privately funded research projects may not always be interested in benefiting as many people and communities as possible. Identifying potential markets here and in wealthy countries abroad may impact where private research dollars are directed. The benefits of public funding brings a measurable level of oversight and accountability to any emerging technology while maximizing the public good. Government-funded research provides for substantial peer review prior to funding, along with basic disclosure requirements requirement of results that help to ensure public dollars are being directed toward research that has the greatest impact in promoting general welfare. In addition, public funding of SynBio assures a level of transparency and accountability, which is mandatory for assuring responsible stewardship while gaining public trust, whereas private funds do not always allow for research into risk assessment, standards that will maximize the public benefit while minimizing the risk associated with a new emerging technology. Centralizing the coordination of current public funding for SynBio activity also creates efficiencies and avoids redundancy, directing scarce public funds where public benefit is maximized and potential risks are minimized. Public funding can enhance the advancement of research that addresses the world's most pressing needs in health, energy, food production, and environmental application. Therefore, this commission found that our recommendation was essential to the idea of public beneficence.
Yes, thank you. So the public funding of research is extremely important. It engages all of us. It brings accountability, oversight, and focus to the field. There are some other inherent advantages of publicly funded research. There are uniform standards for protection of subjects. There is often disclosure requirements of results and substantial peer review that determines funding. And in fact, imbalances between levels of public and private funding make it more difficult for us as a society to be good public stewards of research. One other area where public research may be extremely important is in what's been called the high-risk, high-reward arena. These are areas of immense importance nationally or internationally, but where market forces alone may not be adequate to encourage innovation because of high risk. Two areas where this is particularly relevant are in the development of antibiotics, where there are not financial incentives currently in place, and also the very high risk to develop therapies for neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, which are increasingly prevalent globally as we age. So public support is needed to ensure that we take full advantage of opportunities in synthetic biology. In addition, even basic research is an important avenue for public engagement and support. Basic science is work that focuses on clarifying our understanding of fundamental principles of science and the natural world. Although direct commercial applications of basic science may not always be immediately present, this work in many ways can be extremely valuable to society, and in fact is essential if we are to be successful. The understanding of basic principles is also extremely valuable to prepare us for the emergence of unanticipated risks and problems that require rapid identification of culprits and creative responses. So the second recommendation of our committee states as follows. Advancing the public good should be the primary determinant of relative public investment in synthetic biology versus other scientific activities. The NIH, Department of Energy, and other federal agencies should continue to evaluate research proposals through peer review mechanisms and other deliberative processes created to ensure that the most promising scientific research is conducted on behalf of the public.
Thank you, Steve. The third recommendation of the three under public beneficence will be presented by Anita.
Thank you. The principle of public beneficence would appear to require that researchers, inventors, patent holders, and others work together to develop creative strategies to maximize opportunities for innovation. We can all agree that innovation, and in particular biomedical innovation, has often benefited the public. Innovation can save lives and it can prolong lives. It can improve the quality of life. For example, a new therapeutic medicine or a vaccine. These kinds of things are clearly public goods. As a practical matter, the innovation effort requires a mix of incentives and resources which are efficiently and productively enablers of good work. The free market has to go a long way and does go a long way to promote innovation, but it's not enough. Innovation is often benefited from a mix of secrecy and selective disclosure and sharing. Patent, trademark, trade secrecy, and copyright comprise a legal framework that seeks to facilitate and encourage innovation. So some thought needs to be given to the ways in which academic traditions and business and industry practices, along with information costs and transaction costs and the pre-existing regimes of intellectual property, bear today on the availability of basic research results. There's likely to be a role for government here. It could be education, it could be facilitation, it could be regulation. The Commission has not prejudged exactly what mix of functions are called for. But surely appropriate agencies with the right expertise and the authorization should have on their agendas an examination of whether licensing, registries, and other sharing policies and practices are in place to ensure the availability of the knowledge and the tools needed for advances in the field of synthetic biology. We heard testimony from experts who suggest to us that licensing alternatives could include methods of compulsory or bundled licensing, patent pooling, and broad non-exclusive licenses for foundational technology. Because synthetic biology is in large part based on the application of engineering and principles through which involve the use of standardized modular parts, we are advised that the licensing of these standard components might be a good idea for us to pursue. In fact, they might be critical. Standard setting organizations could be formed by government or the private sector to set standards and negotiate with patent holders to license and commit to licensing their technology on reasonable and non-discriminatory bases. So with these ideas in mind, the Commission has come up with a recommendation that we believe will further the goal of public beneficence. And that third recommendation is that through NIH and other funders, such as the Departments of Defense and Energy, and in collaboration with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the government should examine whether current research licensing and sharing practices are sufficient to ensure that basic research results involving synthetic biology are available to promote innovation. And if not, whether additional policies or best practices are needed. Again, the idea here is to make sure that sufficient sharing practices are available to encourage what's going to be a foundation for innovation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, So that was my mistake. I didn't turn my mic on. Raju, would you like to say anything on any of these three principles?
No, they're good.
Okay. So I'm going to open it up to comments from commission members and then move to the audience as well. So who would like to begin? Nita.
Thank you for presenting those so well and capturing, I know, our shared views on this. I have just a few comments about this section. First, I think it's right that we need to be concerned about public beneficence, and as we think about the different mechanisms to do so, I think that we have it largely right. The language of the recommendations are things that I'm quite comfortable with. Some of the discussion that we're having is something that I'd like to focus a bit. So the first is, in general, the concern about public versus private funding. So I think we recognize that there is a great need, particularly in areas that are of public concern, to have public funding. But I'm not sure that I agree with the idea that an imbalance per se is a bad thing. And in part, I think much of the innovation in this area is being driven by private funding, and I think that is a terrific thing, that there are so many commercial applications and opportunities that are available. Given the limitations of public funding, I also think it's quite fortunate that this area has such tremendous private investment. So I recognize that there are some limitations and concerns with things like transparency and oversight that comes with private funding driving a lot of the research. And I want us to think carefully about ways in which we can increase transparency into private funding mechanisms. I'm not sure that I think that the right answer is simply to try to find parity, though, between public and private funding. Rather, I think it is to look at the different oversight mechanisms. So, in particular, looking at the third recommendation, where we say, through NIH and other funding sources, such as the Department of Defense, and in collaboration with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the government should examine whether current research and licensing and sharing practices are sufficient. I think the first part of this, through NIH and other funding sources, may not be the sole answer. I'm not even sure that that's the venue by which I would suggest we want to ensure that current research licensing and sharing practices are as open as possible, because I think funding is not the primary venue by which we can get there. And in the latter half of this, we say we want to make sure that they're sufficient to promote innovation. I think that's right. We absolutely want to promote innovation, but also to take into account the risks that are attendant to it. So rather than just ensuring that our basic research practices are available to promote innovation, I want to ensure that they are sufficient to ensure oversight of any unique risks and unique concerns that may arise from synthetic biology.
Good, thanks. That's very helpful. There is something. Yeah, go on, Lonnie.
I just wanted to say in part, I agree with Nita on that, but just to note that the imbalance occurs because most private-funded research in SynBio is where there are global markets that will be available for their novel products, and the potential profitability is a significant motivator in that. So therefore, the public funding comes through when there is maybe high-risk, high-reward opportunities to increase the public good, not only here but abroad as well.
Yeah.
So that really is why there is the imbalance occurs, because it's the public beneficence end of it. But I do agree with Anita. There needs to be more oversight into the private as well, and it may not be through public funding, may not ensure that.
One thing we should recognize is there is in this country a very close and dynamic interaction between public and private funding. So take one of the advances in synthetic biology that's furthest along in the treatment of possible really breakthrough treatment of malaria, artemisinin. That is now licensed to a private firm. However, the research that went into that was, a large part of it was publicly financed, and financed through the main single biggest research engine of this country, which is university-sponsored science, a large part of it of which is government funded. So what this recommendation with Lonnie and Nita's friendly amendments suggests is that we make sure, that is the government makes sure, that the practices and the licensing and the regulations ensure that basic research results involving synthetic biology are available to promote both to promote innovation and to avoid unnecessary and inappropriate risks. And that's what the combination of public and private funding would be is, in a sense, parasitic on those concerns. We don't come to the table with any prior view of what proportion of the funding should be public or private. But we do think that the public entities are responsible for ensuring that this research go forward in a way that meets the standards of public beneficence, hence these recommendations. Jim?
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan.
Oh, Dan.
Go ahead.
Dan and then Jim.
Yeah, Lonnie, you slipped so seamlessly into reading the exact wording of the first one. I don't know if you actually changed it, but I can certainly recommend some language later. But I think it needs to be clearer than it was in the initial draft that we had of these, that we're looking for funding to actually study mechanisms for risk assessment and funding for evaluating the ethical and social issues that are raised by synthetic biology. Because I think the wording, at least of what we got initially, doesn't really make that as clear as it needs to be. And I think that quite frankly, industry often doesn't have the greatest incentives to do that kind of research, and there may be, in that sense, bigger opportunities for government funding of those areas in particular.
Good. One thing we know from experience in this, and is just a case of the historical record, is that there are public goods that it is in nobody's economic interest to pursue, and those are the goods such as pursuing what is safe, that if government doesn't fund that, nobody will. Or if government doesn't create incentives such that it be funded, nobody will. It doesn't always have to be direct funding, but there need to be incentives to pursue what the public good is, even for those research designs in synthetic biology, for example, that will overwhelmingly be good, but if they bring with them unnecessary risks and there's no incentive put in place by the public to avoid those risks, we're not fully, as a society, meeting the standards of public beneficence. John?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on...
Oh, yeah, Jim. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Sure, go ahead, Jim.
Your mic's on. Go for it.
Okay, I'm committed technologically.
You're technologically.
I just want to follow up on Dan's comment. So we do need to emphasize the importance of the public funding ethics and social policy oversight issues. We might want to note in this connection that some private groups, including the Venter Institute, have themselves set up ethics oversight committees, and I think they are to be commended for doing that. I mean, I think that this is really a very significant development in this country, where you have lots of groups developing a concern for ethics as well as the fascination of developing the technology. But having said that, I think that as Amy says, we're talking about public goods here, and we don't want to leave the issue of ethical and social oversight to private committees, no matter how well intended or how beneficial.
Jim?
The role of private pursuit of the technology. Thank you. I hit the microphone before she could go to somebody else. The role of the private avenues to advance the technology seems to me has another implication, and let me get around to it. It was interesting to hear these three put together and to listen and pick up a message that I'd like to make sure I am hearing and we all agree with. And a meta message to these three says that we believe that public beneficence is best served through the pursuit of research, not the limitation on research. That we imagine that not only will we take best advantage of the opportunities, but we will also be best prepared to defend ourselves against the risks by pursuing research. The idea that comes in my mind, or the thought that came in my mind as I was hearing this morning, was the history of nuclear science in this country, where in a period following World War II and right up in through the 60s and early 70s, in my own discipline, there were many departments of nuclear engineering. Owing to our fears about what the downsides could be for the spread of nuclear knowledge, most of those departments today are defunct. It's perhaps the case that our country continued to invest in nuclear chemistry in certain ways, but certainly not in nuclear technology. One wonders now that we're ready to re-embrace nuclear technology where it could have been if we hadn't lost 30 years of investment in it. The reason, though, in part that we could shut it down, so to speak, at least within our borders, was because there was not an opportunity for private and DIY investment in the same way. The technology was mega expensive to pursue. I think, it's my long way of saying, I think that's all the more reason that I hope I am hearing from the Commission that it is our recommendation not to arrest research, but to invest in it as a means to address all aspects of public beneficence. Am I hearing that?
And as what the accompaniment to that, you're hearing from the Commission that it is our view that investment in the research is the best way of protecting against the risks, is that there needs to be investment in research about risks. Because another part of the nuclear energy story was that people didn't anticipate the all-too-human risk factor in building nuclear plants, and therefore they were taken by enormous surprise when it turned out that there were, some mega meltdowns. What we're recommending here is very proactive research in identifying risks and having an adequate, and we'll get to that, oversight mechanism, but that's embedded in recommendation 3, an adequate oversight mechanism that takes advantage of the research into the risks.
Amy, may I make one?
Yes, please.
I think an important emphasis with recommendation 3, though, is that we are also saying that we believe that in this context there's something special to be gained from collaboration and sharing, and that we don't think that holding on stingily to our property rights and our secrecy and so forth may be the best way to further our goal in research. So I think we should just underscore that we definitely believe that sharing and collaboration are going to be important to move this science forward.
Good emphasis. Nelson.
So in that sense, there's an inherent incentive for privately funded ventures to do all of this, because ultimately they want to try to mitigate business risks that are associated with technology that fails. In some cases we've seen recently has failed spectacularly. So I think that it isn't simply a matter of companies protecting their corporate interests and minding the short-term bottom line. There's a long-term bottom line that can go significantly southward if there's a major problem.
Good. Open it up to any comments from audience participants. Yes. Paul Wolpe. And I'll ask you each as you get up. I happen to know Paul. He has actually given us terrific testimony in an earlier meeting. But if you go up to the mic, please introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm from Emory University, by the way.
Yeah, we lost you,
yeah,
Paul,
used to be
from Penn. That's a sore point,
yes,
but
well,
it's wonderful to have you in the...
Well,
before my presidency, it should be said.
I've commented before that the fact that my former president and my current president are the chair and vice chair, the connecting link there is obviously. The one
Faculty members are very modest.
The analogy with nuclear energy, one of the areas where this is fundamentally different, and a point about this that I think might be lost, and this is true of both the funding and the oversight issues, is that unlike nuclear energy, which if you were going to get into nuclear energy and research in nuclear energy, you needed a big enterprise. Right. The whole goal of synthetic biology is to create biobricks and other components that you could use individually in a college lab. In fact, biotechnology itself, high school students are now doing genetics that the best scientists couldn't do 15 years ago. So the creation of very small pockets of research in a field where there is some potential for danger creates a kind of oversight challenge and perhaps a funding challenge that is different than the challenge for something like nuclear energy. And I think there is a place where we have to figure out a mechanism to be careful of what is happening in the very small scale research as well as the large business enterprises.
Yeah, and you will see that some of our recommendations come to terms with that, although I think it remains to be said, as you'll see as we say in recommendations, that there's an important balance here between the freedom and innovative aspects of a very decentralized research enterprise, which is more typical of research enterprises, and ensuring safety and being proactive and ensuring a degree of transparency as well. And you're absolutely right. The very nature of the development of bringing nuclear into the public sphere from knowledge into practice is very different. The example that's closer, more analogous, is the recombinant DNA community. And they took it upon themselves to be self-regulating in a way that's very admirable and is a model. Synthetic biology is even more decentralized because of the possibility now of just ordering the biobricks and doing garage science. That said, that isn't the part of the science that dominates the field, and it's still impossible. It may not continue to be impossible, but right now it's impossible to do the sophisticated forms of synthetic biology in your garage. Barbara, did you have something? Yes.
I was just going to say that as a preview under intellectual freedom and responsibility, I'm going to present a recommendation that speaks specifically to this.
Anything else on public beneficence? Otherwise, I'm going to move to responsible stewardship. Good. Responsible stewardship is really a unique principle to, as far as we know, it's unique to the human species to be able to engage in responsible stewardship in the sense that you can have instincts that enable you to maximize benefits and minimize risks, survival instincts, but responsible stewardship really requires a frontal lobe, forward-looking, long-term assessment to be responsible stewards of nature, the Earth's bounty, the world's safety. And we believe that human society and governments have a duty to proceed prudently in promoting science and technology. And much of science and technology has a dual potential to improve human welfare and to harm the environment or to create security risks. We heard a lot about this from those both in the synthetic biology community who were admirably attuned to those risks, and those outside the synthetic biology community who were concerned, ranging from moderately concerned to extremely concerned about those risks. We as a commission think in no uncertain terms that responsible stewardship is a very central principle for synthetic biology moving forward because of both the intrinsic nature of some synthetic biology, which by that I mean that synthetic biology has not yet, but it promises to be able at some point to create new and modified species and organisms, and that has an influence on biodiversity and the environment. And also it has the ability to make us rethink, as much of science has to date, the relationship of human beings to the natural world in its evolutionary state. So when you can manufacture organisms and potentially inject them into the environment, something that I should say has not yet been done by synthetic biology, but synthetic biology is looking forward to the day it can do that for some very good reasons, to be able to treat malaria more effectively, to be able to create vaccines more efficiently, to be able to create environmentally friendly biofuels. When that day comes, and if that day comes, which science is looking forward to, responsible stewardship says we need to be prepared both to make sure those uses are good, do good in the environment, do good to people who don't have the power right now to represent themselves, in part because some of those people don't exist yet, but also to minimize the risks to the environment and what now would be unforeseen risks, but to try to consider what kinds of mechanisms would be most consistent with responsible stewardship. So we will start with, this is, if you're keeping track, the fourth recommendation, but the first one under responsible stewardship, and I turn to Alex for that.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I apologize in advance for my voice. It seems like I've been afflicted by a biological issue as well. But I'm going to speak... a
natural one, not a synthetic one,
exactly.
Right?
I work for Homeland Security, but this was natural. I'm going to speak specifically about oversight. Mm-hmm. In the United States, oversight frameworks already exist for a great deal of activities that we do, including research on humans, animals, microorganisms, and toxins, and including recombinant DNA. Oversight also occurs with regard to laboratory worker safety, with funding and research, with the transport and containment of dangerous agents. So in the course of our deliberations, we learned of the numerous oversight bodies and the mechanisms currently in place to review and approve biological research technology products, including synthetic biology. And many of these approaches rely on long-standing regulatory systems, such as foods and drugs and chemicals. And others have been developed specifically to address genetic engineering and biotechnology. These oversight policies tend to be predicated on a risk-benefit assessment that is scaled according to the identified risk, and that evolves through an ongoing process, including open public dialogue. The evolving federal oversight framework for synthetic biology has been built upon these existing oversight responsibilities exercised by various federal agencies, which include the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency for Chemical Safety, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration for Food, Drugs, and Medical Devices, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture for Crops and Food Substances, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services and Homeland Security. And this fits in well, I believe, also with the discussions that we had with our international partners, where the communities have come together to focus on the ethical, the legal, and the policy issues internationally, including the European Commission that supported SynBioSafe, which is a collaborative project among public and private parties. Because of these established frameworks, At this time, we do not see a need to create additional agencies or oversight bodies focused specifically on synthetic biology. Rather, we urge that appropriate entities within the Executive Office of the President, in consultation with relevant federal agencies, develop a clear, defined, and coordinated approach to synthetic biology research and development. A mechanism or review should be identified by 4 different issues. 1, leveraging existing resources by providing ongoing and coordinated review of developments in synthetic biology across federal agencies. 2, ensuring the regulatory requirements are consistent and non-contradictory. 3, to stay abreast of international developments and coordinate issues across governments. And number 4, to periodically and on a timely basis inform the public of its findings. These activities might be carried out under the auspices of OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or another coordinating committee.
Thanks. The 5th recommendation, that is the 4th recommendation, the first under responsible stewardship, the 2nd under responsible stewardship, and the 5th, if you're counting as I am, John Aris will present.
Thank you, Amy. So this particular item relates to our attitude toward risk and how risk analyses will be undertaken. Amy Gutman mentioned earlier the sense in which our commission is going beyond the Belmont framework here. And here's a salient example of that, where the Belmont report argued that the benefits, both to patients and to society, should be taken into account by IRBs.
You should say what IRBs are.
By institutional review boards that are scrutinizing the research in every center that's publicly funded. And also that the burdens to patients or the burdens to participants in the research also be carefully scrutinized. But Belmont didn't really talk about social risks. In fact, Belmont precludes the discussion of social risks in an IRB process. So I think one thing that this principle does is bring social risks into the ambit of the ethical principles that we're looking at. So here's the problem. Synthetic biology is a new and very energetic field. We're witnessing very rapid development. It's very difficult to predict ahead of time exactly what sorts of benefits will eventually be derived and what sorts of risks will eventually materialize here. We're really speculating largely in the dark. So we're facing a great amount of uncertainty. And of course, this is the big problem in social policy. What is the proper attitude toward risk when the future is shrouded in uncertainty? That's the big problem. Especially when you're dealing with events that are of low probability but very high impact. So we can predict, for example, that organisms might be let loose into the larger environment, wreaking havoc out there. Again, these synthetic organisms will be living, so they'll be able to reproduce and colonize perhaps various areas of the environment. So this is a very serious risk. And of course, but we don't really, it's hard to predict exactly what the likelihood of that is. The same goes for risks that can be lumped under the heading of bioterrorism, bad actors doing bad things. We know that they will probably be out there, but it's hard to get a grip on exactly what the quantity of the risk is. So there are a couple of ways of handling risk that we gloss in our report. The first might be described as a proactive approach to risk. full speed ahead, worry about the risks later. There are values behind this particular attitude toward risk. There's the value of scientific freedom and a tremendous focus on the benefits that can be derived from it. We would argue, however, that the proactive approach really underappreciates the risk. So standing on its own, it doesn't appear to be a very acceptable principle. Now, at the other extreme, we have what we call the precautionary principle, which we've seen deployed in Europe, for example, over the debate involving genetically modified foods. And according to this principle, all the risks involved with a particular technology must be identified and mitigated, or there must be a promise of mitigation before one goes forward with the research or the deployment of a technology. We would argue that this approach underappreciates the benefits that might be derived from SynBio. This is a very difficult problem because we don't seem to have a theory of risk in hand that tells us exactly what the appropriate risk-benefit ratio should be, that tells us exactly how great the risks need to be or how likely the risks need to be before we intervene and stop the research. Different people, animated by different projects, different values, can come down on different sides of this particular question. And we've seen how this has happened over the issue of genetically modified foods in Europe and the United States. The Europeans are very suspicious of this technology, and we are much less so. So it's not written anywhere that there is that there's an ideal risk-benefit assessment here. And so I think one way of framing redescribing what we've done here is to opt for a procedural solution to this problem. We describe this as, and it's a procedural approach is really a good example of trying to find a good Aristotelian mean between two extremes. We call it prudent vigilance. And this includes ongoing assessments of risk as the technology develops. So because there's so much uncertainty, we argue that the technology should go forward, but with lots of safeguards and with an iterative process regarding the discovery and the assessment and the response to risk. And second, as Alex just mentioned, we're also advocating that whatever coordinating body within the government is responsible for SynBio, that it should convene an interagency process that makes sure that all the different agencies of the federal government are playing according to the same playbook and that their approaches to risk management are harmonized in some sense. So that gets us to the actual statement of the principle. So here's principle number 5. Because of the difficulty of risk analysis in the face of uncertainty, particularly for low probability, high impact events, ongoing assessments will be needed as the field progresses. Regulatory systems should be updated as necessary to ensure that regulators have adequate information. The coordinating body recommended above should convene an interagency process to discuss risk assessment activities, including reasons for differences and strategies for greater harmonization if appropriate.
So to further the concept of safeguards through responsible stewardship, I'll give you a personal anecdote about how it's important for us to harness the benefits of technology, but also to mitigate the risks. So I've had the opportunity of the past months to take all too many long airline trips all around the world, and some of those airlines allow you to listen into traffic control, and it's always amazing to me how several dozen aircraft trying to land all at once at Frankfurt International Airport can be kept away from each other and actually land, in many cases, multiple aircraft all landing on different runways all at the same time. This is not something that developed overnight. All of us, I think, perhaps with the security screening aside, can agree that airline travel is a useful thing that we've developed as a society. But the risks are significant in terms of that technology being used for nefarious purposes, as well as that technology having spectacular failures. And the airline industry and its various regulators do a tremendous effort to ensure that this is one of the safest ways of traveling. In the same sense, I think we all on the Commission have struggled with the significant benefits that synthetic biology as an extension of its predecessor of more conventional genetic engineering or molecular biology offers us. However, it's important for us to understand and to communicate to the public how the practitioners of this new technology need to, much like the airline industry does, continuously ensure that risk is mitigated. How can that be done? So the intent of consequences of research designs need to be put into a framework where organisms that are developed in the laboratories, number one, can be tracked while they're both in the laboratories and during either an intentional and regulated release or during an unattended release, so that we actually need to know where the organisms are, in the same way that the airliner that I landed in Frankfurt, the air traffic control knew where it was from the time that it pushed back from the gate, from the time that it pulled into a gate in Germany. Two is that in the possibility that these organisms would be released into the natural environment, again, either deliberately with controls or by accident or by other nefarious mechanisms, that the technology and safeguards would be in place to contain those organisms. Now, there's lots of ways to do that, and one flavor of that containment would be to make this organism such a wimp environmentally that it really just couldn't compete against its brothers and sisters out in the field. And this is frankly something that in molecular biology was done in the 70s to make the E. coli organism that we commonly engineer so biologically non-selective that it tends to get overwhelmed when it encounters natural forms of its species. And lastly, maybe in a way that an errant missile, and I can tell you that in the department that I work with, these safeguards are in place for weapon systems that can go awry. There are usually ways that those weapon systems can be disabled. In the same fashion, from a molecular standpoint, one can build in mechanisms that would allow kill switches or suicide genes, if you will, to be activated, and those agents could in fact be contained at the most fundamental level, which is for them to be disabled. So, what's the way for us to implement these? We discussed public funding, which would clearly mandate that developers of this technology build in these kinds of safeguards. But in the same way, the incentives that we've discussed in the first three recommendations for why companies would want to clearly invest in these kinds of safeguards, I think is pretty clear. So I think public funding is important, providing incentives to industry to partner at the same time as civil society and governments do to put these kinds of safeguards in place makes sense. In the same way that United Airlines, of course, is happy to comply with some FAA regulations, which in the long run make sure that its planes stay in the air and land safely and not abruptly. And lastly, the need for standardization of these safeguards, so that as we, as a scientific community and as civil society and government, look into how this technology evolves, that we can build on each other's experiences with making safeguards, so that one identification transponder on an aircraft landing in Germany will work with the same aircraft landing in Tokyo. So let me get to the recommendation itself. And I'm reading a provisional recommendation number 6, which language will probably change a bit. New organisms should be marked or branded in some manner to help the government monitor developments in synthetic biology, at least until further information is gathered about the ability of a synthetic microbial organism to multiply in the natural environment So-called, quote-unquote, suicide genes or other types of self-destruction triggers should be engineered into organisms in order to place a limit on their lifespans. Alternatively, engineered organisms could be made to depend on nutritional components absent outside the laboratory, such as novel amino acids, and thereby controlled in the event of release.
Thank you. And the next recommendation under responsible stewardship, Steve Hauser is going to present. Steve.
Thank you. An additional issue relates to how do we time the deliberate release of synthesized organisms into the environment, and how do we analyze risks prior to release. Everyone would agree that we must proceed carefully, especially when there is a chance or a probability that the risks will be considerable, and also recognizing that the properties of released organisms may not be predictable in a laboratory once they are released in the environment. And generally, the methods for risk assessment throughout the scientific community and oversight agencies is to evaluate any new organism in terms of its known relatives, and to set containment rules or environmental risk mitigation strategies based on the applicable rules for the known relative. And this approach appears to have worked quite effectively, and has been able to evolve as methods, as science has evolved. In terms of synthetic biology, we need to be certain that the assessment is based on potential function as well as the known structure or sequence of organisms that are released. And this needs created because new attributes of synthetic organisms may not have the same or similar structure to those of their naturally occurring forebears. Prudent vigilance is required to assure that the strategy of how we compare new to old organisms, when the old organisms exist, remains effective as the field matures. So our next recommendation is as follows. The Executive Office of the President, in consultation with other federal agencies, should ensure that risk assessment is carried out under the National Environmental Protection Act or other applicable law prior to field release of any product of synthetic biology technologies. This review should analyze any gaps and evaluate the appropriateness and feasibility of requiring a reasonable environmental impact assessment prior to the release of biosynthetic organisms from a contained laboratory setting, including, as appropriate, plans for staging the introduction or release. Results of all reviews should be made available to the public. Exceptions may be made in cases of substantial equivalency or emergencies.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to open it up for commission members' comments and any comments or questions from the public. Nita.
First, I just have to say one of the great pleasures of being on this commission is hearing different perspectives, and I particularly enjoyed Nelson's different descriptions of the types of risks that we were talking about and thinking about it from a different perspective and a military perspective. So that was great and quite helpful. I just wanted to emphasize on that particular recommendation, as we've discussed, that I think it's important that we make that as broad as possible because, as we know, this is a field that is rapidly advancing. And so while today we've heard a great deal, not today, but over the past couple of meetings, we've heard a great deal of testimony about the novel, new, different kill mechanisms or nutritional depletion mechanisms in order to contain different organisms from being released, the science may evolve rapidly and quickly. And my concern is that if we put something quite specific about the containment measures into our recommendations, I would caution against any sort of policy that did so to ensure that the science is always able to have the best possible containment measures. So I think our recommendation is really one to ensure that containment occurs rather than advocating any specific type of containment. A second comment is on recommendation number 7. And This is just a question about, I'm in agreement with the issues that we've raised, which is identifying risk assessment prior to release. I'm concerned, though, about unintended release and how our recommendations are really addressing unintended release and whether we're getting at that. So forecasting a bit ahead as we look at biosafety and biosecurity concerns, I'm not sure that we fully do address that. And so I'm wondering if there's a possibility of thinking about risk assessment at the point at which any novel organism is created, let alone released. So if new, whether it's private companies or public companies, have created novel organisms that obviously have the potential to be released through inadvertent or through intentional mechanisms, are we addressing that? And could we address that such that there needs to be a risk assessment provided by any company that does develop a novel organism?
Yeah, I wonder if anybody on the commission who does lab science can address that, because it actually is something like many of our concerns. This one is not only relevant to SynBio, but it's really about the importance within the lab of taking the kinds of precautions that would prevent unintended release.
Or even just risk assessment of the creation of novel organisms.
Because we do it backwards now, right? In other words, when we are working with high risk organisms and in biological containment laboratories of different levels, we do that because we know a priori they're of high risk.
Right.
What do we do in this case? Where how does one do that risk assessment in order to determine the level of containment, and would it be crippling just to force everything into that highest level of containment?
And let me just frame this so we understand. I know the commission members understand this, but at present, synthetic biology is really struggling with the opposite problem, which is creating a novel organism that's robust enough to survive even in the lab. So I think it's important for all of us to communicate to ourselves and the public that right now there is no clear and immediate danger of this. Quite the contrary. The scientists, and not only the scientists working in this in SynBio, but all the scientists have told us that the bigger challenge right now is to create organisms that are anywhere close as robust as organisms. These are very simple organisms in the natural world. Nonetheless, as we see this field going forward, this gives us a great opportunity to ensure that these kinds of risks are taken into account and protected against to the extent possible and prudent. And I've just underlined the prudent vigilance is what we're looking for here. Nelson.
So at the University of Pennsylvania, our last speaker was one of my personal heroes, since I was trained as a molecular biologist as well as an internal medicine physician. And Sidney Brenner, at the end of his conversations, of course he had lived through the Asilomar conference and the self-governing, as was mentioned previously, with the predecessor of synthetic biology, which is molecular biology. And he basically said at the very end that he thinks that there isn't any imminent threat as well, but we just need to continue to watch. And, to me, I am a lab scientist, and we have very significant controls in place, but I don't think we can be complacent. We need to constantly reassess whether or not those controls are adequate. Maybe the organisms being made today are WIMPs, but maybe that will change sometime in the future. And so I think we just need to continue to take his advice and to watch and to monitor, to have this process be as transparent as possible, as Nita and others have mentioned, which I think is critical, to make sure there aren't firewalls. And I think we can get around the safety concerns that at the same time that would protect trade secrets for commercial concerns, that all of us have an investment to do this right.
Good. Yes, Steve.
So you've obviously raised two large points here, and the first is a very important one that I don't think we have covered, but it relates to the rules that are currently in place to the notification rules and mitigation of problem rules following unintended release or access of information by unauthorized users in a laboratory sufficiently in place for synthetic biology. The second issue is the registry issue, which is a harder subject.
Nita.
To that point, for the first one, and also to Jim's point, it seems like it's possible that given that we at least know particular things like select agents or regions or oligonucleotides which are used and more likely to have high impact, that it may not be the case that we can do an adequate risk assessment for every novel organism that is created, and particularly those in which you may actually, in fact, be able to do sort of a de facto one, right? You are using things that our belief is, at least the way we currently understand how they're assembled, it's unlikely to pose any great risk. If you're using any of the select agents or sequences that we think might potentially, in combination with other sequences, pose a greater risk, then there's a greater concern. I don't think we're getting at that, what happens in the laboratory side of things. We're only looking at it from a release perspective, and so it seems possible that we could do some sort of risk assessment for the creation of novel organisms, at least within categories, right? If you are using select products, if you are using particularly high-risk sequences, then it may be that whether it's registration or whether it's tracking, somehow we need to have greater oversight of those things.
Right. So we need to, in one of these recommendations, and there are several that would accommodate it, make sure we talk about what can be done for oversight of the unintended release while it's still part of laboratory science. I think that's a very good, a friendly amendment to one of these recommendations, and part of, in our report, we have to address that
more fully. So the risk of release is not unique
right.
to SynBio, and so we do have experience
Correct.
in that, albeit it's within the BSL labs. But risk and uncertainty is notoriously difficult to do. The Department of Homeland Security does risk assessments for biological, chemical, and nuclear threat. And I can tell you that it is a very onerous and controversial process that it goes through. And that is because, by its very definition, they're low probability events. And so there's no history to base your risk off of. Us as physicians base risk of disease off of prior disease. And so I can tell you that cigarette smoking increases your risk for a heart attack so many numbers of times, but we can't do that with SynBio. So I think the objective of prudent vigilance is almost by necessity what we have to do in order to be an ongoing assessment of risk.
Right. We have strongly believe that the responsible way of proceeding here is through prudent vigilance, and it really is a difference between a completely proactive approach which says just let science rip, and the precautionary principle says stop until you know that you have mitigated the risks. And the analogy that works here, and it's only an analogy, is with medical care. We don't say to people who have a disease, have some ailment, we don't say just get treated regardless of the safety of the treatment, nor do we say don't get treated until you know that there is no risk of the treatment. Because, and the reason it's a good analogy, is there are real benefits to be had, for example, in having an anti-malaria drug that's efficiently made for populations, because people will die. And they are dying. 700,000 to 1 million people are dying every year of malaria. And so if you enact a precautionary principle, there are going to be people who die who might be saved. At the same time, if you just let science rip, you can have all kinds of unknown risks that you haven't taken any due precautions against. So that's where we come down, and it won't satisfy either extreme, but I think it is the responsible way of proceeding and advising both private and public parties who are engaged in this field. Yes, I want to go out. If there anybody... okay, Christine. Just if there is anyone who wants to make a comment or question, just stand up to the mic and I will recognize you.
I just wanted to emphasize something that's embedded in one of these provisional recommendations, but maybe we need to emphasize more, and that is how we do the coordination, but also how we do this risk assessment internationally, and recognizing that the recommendation that Alex read earlier says stay abreast of international developments and coordinate issues across governments, and we know that historically different governments have taken different stands on the precautionary principle versus let science rip, as you said, Amy. So this notion of coordinating these kinds of monitoring and risk assessment and prudent vigilance in an international environment is a challenge that we need to emphasize in our report.
Right. And we don't approach this, correct me if I'm wrong, assuming that every international body and country will agree on the same principles. That certainly isn't the case with genetically modified organisms. But we do approach it with the sense that to the extent that we can get agreement, there will be a better international system of oversight and of investment in science, which has become which has become a global enterprise, and everything that we're recommending nationally is going to have international repercussions. And the same is true for our analogous bodies internationally. John?
Yes, to follow up, Chris, I think that because we lack a canonical, theoretical picture of what the ideal risk-benefit analysis would look like in this kind of a case, we do stand to learn from other countries and the way they conceive of these problems. So it is a worldwide problem which requires coordination, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn.
Other commission or audience questions or comments? If not, we're right on time. We're going to take a lunch break. We will reconvene at 2:00, and we will continue with our recommendations, and we will also have a presentation at 3:30 by Tom Murray, who is the president of the Hastings Center, which is one of the premier centers for bioethics in the country. Thank you all.